Welcome to our voyage through one of the most unsettling incidents in recorded history. Time has never been able to obliterate the truths hidden in the mountains, and we will reveal one of them today. This narrative will have an impact on you, so leave a comment where you are watching. This film was made entirely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. High in the dark Appalachian mountains, where old pine trees are snagged by mist, there is a legend that locals would rather not share, and the stillness is as heavy as lead. The story starts in 1879, when creaking wagons were still used to cross mountain roads, and civilization looked too far away to provide any kind of safety. Eliza Caldwell vanished from the area of a small village in Watauga County, North Carolina, that year, leaving only rumors and an inexplicable trail of occurrences in her wake. Eliza was not your typical person. She had been in that mountainous area for a few years, bringing with her a reputation that loomed over her like a shadow from the Virginia lands. When the local doctors had already given up on treating ailments, she was reported to have knowledge of plants and treatments. People stalked her, following secret paths to her remote cottage, which was always after dark. Nestled in a clearing encircled by twisted trees, she lived alone in a dark wooden building where not even the birds appeared to sing. The neighborhood kept an unclear bond with her, vacillating between appreciation and mistrust. Eliza was invoked in times of terrible illness. She was held responsible when an unexplained event occurred. This precarious equilibrium persisted until the fall of 1879, when a number of odd occurrences started to rock that mountainous area. There were no obvious traces of an attack when farm animals were discovered dead. Early in the morning, many reported hearing voices whispering in the trees. Then, one morning in November of that year, Eliza Caldwell just vanished. His cabin was discovered undamaged, with the door swinging in the chilly mountain breeze like a jar. With the exception of one unsettling feature that witnesses would never forget, everything within appeared to be in its proper place. No one recognized the circular patterns of symbols painted on the walls using what seemed like plant ash. A circle of precisely geometrically positioned stones stood in the middle of the one chamber, and candles burned until the last bit of wax was gone. The cabin's air had an odd scent that made people unconsciously shudder, a blend of charred plants and something deeper and older. The closest neighbors, who lived over 3 kilometers away, reported that the night before the disappearance, they heard odd chants coming from that area. They weren't words from any language they knew, including English. The hounds howled in response to a guttural, repeated sound that reverberated throughout the valleys. The quiet returned as the sun rose, but Eliza had gone, leaving behind only those unfathomable symbols and a feeling of presence that seemed to fill the deserted cottage. Due to the limited resources available at the time, local authorities only briefly searched the surrounding trails and ravines. They discovered nothing to suggest where she might have gone, not even a body or footprints. Eliza Caldwell seemed to have simply vanished into the mist of the mountains, leaving only unsolved mysteries and a mounting terror that started to contaminate the neighborhood. Within, other unexplainable incidents increased in the days after the disappearance. One family claimed to have seen a female figure strolling through the woodland at night, but she was always out of their line of sight and never got close enough to be recognized. Tools vanished from barns that were locked. The animals would not approach Eliza's deserted cabin. The tales of the curse then started, narratives that would turn the case into one of Appalachia's most sinister and persistent mysteries. Records from Watauga County stored in dusty archives that have. There is something unnerving about the months after Eliza Caldwell's disappearance that has withstood the test of time. 7 members of the same community unexpectedly and mysteriously became ill between December 1879 and March 1880. The same symptoms persisted: night insanity, a high fever, and an unsettling need to repeat sentences that nobody could understand. Due to their scarcity and excessive workload, the doctors in the area were unable to identify the reason of this peculiar ailment. The pattern was what made it even more unsettling. During the past year, all 7 individuals had sought Eliza's help for a medical condition. Everyone claimed to have had recurrent dreams about the missing woman, and everyone had been inside that gloomy wooden hut. Dreams in which she sang those weird songs that the neighbors had heard that fateful night while walking in circles among an infinite number of trees. People in the neighborhood started talking about a curse. It was real terror based on occurrences that defied logic, not just superstitious nonsense. Justification. Similar tales were recounted around campfires by the oldest families in the area, whose ancestors had visited those mountains decades earlier. They discussed customs that European immigrants had brought with them, knowledge that had been secretly passed down through the generations, and rituals that offered control over life and death. These rumors circulated that Eliza had discovered something she shouldn't have. Josiah McKinney, a local preacher and man of unshakable faith, made the decision to act. Within, he assembled a team of volunteers in February 1880 to carry out a more comprehensive search of Eliza's land and the surrounding area. They explored the cabin from top to bottom, looked at the rundown barn in the back, and followed paths that wound up the mountain. What they discovered left them with more mysterious questions rather than any answers. There was an unsettling assortment of items in the basement that was dug down under the cabin and reached by a trapdoor that was concealed beneath loose floorboards. Glass bottles filled with different colored liquids, branded with tasteful lettering in Latin, wearable leather books with pages full of comments in several languages, intricate diagrams depicting star locations and lunar phases, and star maps that were outdated at the time. Additionally, there was a carved wooden box in the darkest corner of that underground area that had private letters written to Eliza from several East Coast states. A network of correspondence with comparable interests to hers was exposed by the letters. They mentioned setting up meetings in far-off places, of customs from before these areas were colonized, of knowledge that has been kept hidden from the view of the law and the church. A meeting was scheduled for early November in the mountains in one of the letters dated September 1879, just 2 months before she vanished. The sender, who only signed with the initials M.H., spoke about a rite of passage that would necessitate meticulous planning and complete seclusion. A shiver ran down Josiah McKinney's spine as he read those letters in the wavering light of lamps. Down his back. He concluded that those substances were too hazardous to continue being available. He made arrangements for the burning of everything in the cellar with the tacit consent of the local authorities, who were equally troubled by the findings. In the clearing in front of the cabin, a blaze burned for hours, reducing everything to ashes, including the books, letters, and jars. However, peace did not result from the destruction of those items. Indeed, the situation worsened. Reports of observations of the phenomenon increased. A woman in the woods. She always showed up at sunset when the brightness of day blended with the deepening darkness. Witnesses reported seeing a deliberate silhouette moving amid the trees, always maintaining a safe distance and vanishing whenever someone attempted to get close. Some claimed to have heard a voice calling her name from the deep valleys, a voice that sounded both close and far away at the same time. An eerie quiet descended upon the Appalachian Mountains in the spring of 1880. As usual, flowers bloomed on the hillsides, yet there was a shift in that village. As if mentioning Eliza Caldwell would draw her notice from wherever she might be, people refrained from talking about her out loud. Social events, which were formerly frequent on porches and at nearby churches, became uncommon. Every family withdrew into their own world, closing their doors at night and hoping that there would be no upsetting news in the morning. A tourist arrived in the area amid this atmosphere of quiet tension. He identified himself as Thomas Whitmore, a researcher of unexplained phenomena who documented stories of weird incidents while traveling around the southern states. After reading a tiny article on Eliza's case in a Raleigh newspaper, Thomas became curious and traveled to those isolated highlands. He kept leather notebooks with him, in which he painstakingly documented every detail, witness, and piece of information he was able to obtain. At first, the residents refused to talk to him. In that era and location, mistrust of strangers was normal, but there was more. Talking about the issue with an outsider seemed to somehow confirm what they were going through, turning their personal anxieties into actual, palpable realities. But Thomas was tenacious and courteous. He stayed in a small guest house for weeks in the neighborhood, slowly winning some people over with thoughtful chats and sincere tolerance. Martha Henderson was among the first to confide in him. She had known Eliza herself. According to Martha, Eliza had come to the area in 1875 following the death of her husband for reasons she never disclosed. After relocating to that remote home, she soon gained recognition for her expertise in medicine. In 1877, Eliza treated Martha herself after she contracted a serious respiratory ailment that local physicians were unable to manage. Within a few weeks, Eliza's herbal remedies had brought her health back. However, Martha also disclosed darker details. According to her, Eliza would sometimes talk about her ancestry, tracing a family tree that dated back to immigrants from the Scottish Highlands a century earlier. Eliza claimed that these individuals carried with them antiquated customs and worldviews that predate Christianity and had been meticulously conserved over many generations. Eliza thought that special rites carried out at specified times in the lunar calendar awakened certain wisdom that was handed down through blood. Thomas. He kept track of everything in his notebooks and connected it to other instances he had looked at in Kentucky and Tennessee. Throughout the Appalachians, he observed a recurring pattern: women living alone in remote places, with information that made them both important and feared, going missing under strange circumstances that rocked entire towns. That mountain range seemed to contain mysteries that would not stay hidden. While conducting his research, Thomas made the decision to visit the deserted cabin of Eliza. Even if the building remained intact, nature was already taking it back. The outside walls were covered in vines. The roof appeared to be about to fall, and roots penetrated the stone foundations. That location was no longer visited by anyone in the neighborhood. They claimed that weird lights, seeming as though invisible candles were burning inside, could be seen through the damaged windows at night. At noon, when the sun was at its zenith and light was coming through the gaps in the cabin, Thomas went inside. Roof damage. Nevertheless, the room appeared darker than it ought to have been. He carefully copied the symbols he studied on the walls into his notebook. He descended to the cellar, where Josiah McKinney's bonfire had left only ashes and burned pieces. However, he was drawn to something. A solitary object had been concealed in a small, hollow hole that was exposed by a loose board in the cellar wall. It was a little journal that had managed to avoid being destroyed and was bound in fading cloth. The pages were, including Eliza's exquisite handwriting, which she used to record her studies, experiments with various medicinal remedies, and other things. The final writings, made in October 1879, mentioned a rite she intended to undertake that would change her life. She wrote about passing through a threshold, letting go of physical constraints, and arriving at a level of being that went beyond conventional wisdom. The words were mysterious, but there was no denying the resolve behind them. Feeling the weight of that revelation, Thomas put the diary away. He was aware that he had discovered a crucial piece of information that would help explain Eliza's absence. However, he couldn't get rid of the sensation that he was being watched as he left the cabin that afternoon, as though something in the clearing's shadows knew he was there and didn't like his intrusion. In his room at the boarding house, Thomas Whitmore worked by the dim light of a lamp for the next few weeks, interpreting Eliza Caldwell's diary. The notes showed a sharp and well-organized mind. Eliza was not just a healer with intuition. She was a committed academic who had devoted years to studying esoteric customs, using allusions from various historical periods and cultures. Her writings included deep philosophical contemplations on the essence of existence, inquiries concerning the limits of the tangible and intangible, and speculations regarding altered states of consciousness that, at the time, sounded both mystical and scientific. Thomas was worried by the work's apparent growth. The initial entries, which date back to 1876, were tentative and investigative. Eliza recorded family-inherited recipes, traditional treatments, and observations on Appalachian medicinal plants. However, her notes grew bolder and more experimental as the years passed. She had started pushing the boundaries of her knowledge in an effort to comprehend more profound aspects of human existence, as well as to treat illnesses. A few months prior to her disappearance, in July 1879, Eliza wrote about her experience with the mysterious, a tourist who had visited the area. She just referred to him as the Pilgrim of the Western Mountains without mentioning his name. According to her notes, this man had imparted knowledge to her that had been preserved by rural populations in Tennessee's most remote areas. He mentioned rites of passage that were carried out during particular seasons of the year when the distinctions between various states of life were less clear. Eliza had been captivated. She had penned lengthy essays considering the ramifications of those discussions, wondering if a well-prepared individual might willingly overcome those obstacles. She was referring to a purposeful metamorphosis rather than death in the traditional sense, a procedure that would necessitate rigorous mental, physical, and spiritual preparation. It was a concept that went against every scientific and ecclesiastical norm of the day, and Thomas saw that Eliza had devoted herself entirely to its investigation. The final entries in the diary were both the most illuminating and the most mysterious. Eliza wrote a detailed account of her preparations for what she dubbed the Black Moon Ritual in October 1879. She spoke about extended fasts, meditations in the forest at night, and the collection of particular materials at certain times of the moon. She talked of establishing defenses through old symbols, making her hut a sacred sanctuary, and bringing her mind into harmony with natural cycles that most people were unaware of. In her most recent post, dated November 2nd, 1879, the day before she vanished, Eliza's handwriting revealed scarcely restrained enthusiasm. She declared that she had finished all the necessary preparations and was prepared. She wrote that she would start the procedure she had been preparing for months at the rise of the new moon. Her last remarks were quite disturbing. If my understanding of the ancestors' teachings is right, I shall no longer be recognized by anyone in my current shape at daybreak. But I'll be here more than ever before, monitoring, defending, and preserving what I've discovered. May those who came to me for assistance find serenity, and may those who were afraid of me realize that there is much more out there than meets the eye. With a mixture of admiration and worry, Thomas closed the diary. Throughout his career, he had looked at a lot of odd cases, but he had never come across something so purposeful and well-planned. Tragic events or forces outside of Eliza's control have not befallen her. She had made her own decision based on a strong belief that, although most would view it as insanity, for her was the result of years of preparation and research. Did this, however, account for what happened next? Thomas felt he needed to look into the unexplained ailments that plagued the people she had treated, the persistent reports of seeing the female figure in the woods, and the voices that resounded through the valleys at night. He made the decision to go look for Pastor Josiah McKinney, who was responsible for organizing the stuff in the cabin to be destroyed. I hope he could give further background information on what happened after the disappearance. In unexpected ways, Thomas's interaction with Josiah was illuminating. The preacher had a severe appearance and appeared to have aged too quickly due to his heavy workload. He welcomed Thomas inside his modest house, which was connected to the community's small log church. Josiah started out by giving a realistic account of what had happened, but as the discussion went on, his controlled demeanor started to crumble, exposing a guy who was truly troubled by what he had seen. On the night he had planned the burning of the materials discovered in Eliza's cellar, Josiah McKinney told Thomas something he had never told anybody before. Something had happened to him that had severely damaged his faith. He claimed to have seen a figure emerge from the smoke as the books and papers were devoured by the fire, a female silhouette that regarded him with an unidentifiable look. It was an indisputable presence that appeared to come from out of the flames, but it was neither solid nor defined, suspended for a short while before vanishing into the darkness. Josiah was unable to sleep soundly after that night. He often woke up in the middle of the night feeling as though someone was watching him and that something was waiting patiently in his room's shadows. His prayers, which were formerly a constant source of solace, seemed to go unanswered. He had started to doubt things he had always taken for granted, wondering whether there were more levels of reality that his oversimplified theology could not capture. Reach. Josiah's revelation that he was not alone in this experience was even more unsettling. Similar feelings were described by other community members, particularly those who had taken part in the search of Eliza's property, or who had witnessed the materials being burned. Every night, a woman reported hearing footsteps circling her home. A farmer reported discovering symbols, exactly the same ones that adorned the walls of the deserted cabin drawn in the ground surrounding his barn. A whole family has relocated, evacuated the area following months of unexplained disruptions that had left them scared and worn out. With a researcher's analytical mind, Thomas took in this information, but he also became increasingly uneasy. He was accustomed to looking into claims of odd occurrences, but he typically kept his emotions in check and approached each case as a puzzle that needed to be solved. But there was something odd about this case. The testimonies had an unsettling consistency, the pattern that implied something. Transcend rustic superstition or widespread frenzy. Thomas made the decision to spend the night in the woods close to Eliza's deserted cabin in order to have a better understanding of the circumstances. He was aware that it was a risky choice, but his curiosity and dedication to the research exceeded any anxiety. Josiah attempted to dissuade him by pointing out the area's inherent and inexplicable hazards, but Thomas was unwavering in his resolve. He pledged to provide a comprehensive report of his findings back in the morning. On the afternoon of May 15th, 1880, Thomas camped in a tiny clearing 100 meters away from the cottage. Along with his notebooks, the temperature and humidity measuring devices he employed for his investigations, and probably more boldness than caution would advise, he had carried enough provisions for the night. As the sun descended over the mountains, casting orange and purple hues across the sky, Thomas started a bonfire, bracing himself for whatever lay ahead. It was quiet for the first couple of hours. Thomas penned in. By the light of the flames, he arranged his observations in his notebooks and went over Eliza's journal notes. The sounds of nightlife, such as crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional owl hooting in the distance, were provided by the nearby forest. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. An eerie silence fell over the region about midnight. The chirping of the crickets ceased. The wind stopped altogether. The trees appeared to be holding their breath as well. Thomas sensed the air becoming more dense and charged with an A. It had an electrifying quality that caused his arms to stand on end. His instruments revealed a sharp decline in temperature that was far more noticeable than would be expected at that time of year. Despite his heart racing uncontrollably, he forced himself to retain scientific discipline as he painstakingly documented these changes. Then he paid attention. From the direction of the deserted cottage came a gentle, far-off singing. There was a spooky tune that appeared to blend in with the night itself, but the words were unrecognizable. It had a mesmerizing, even erotic aspect that compelled Thomas to stand up and move in the direction of the sound's origin. His hands trembled a little as he recorded every aspect of the encounter, fighting the need and holding fast to reason. For a moment that seemed both fleeting and unending, the singing went on. It was impossible for Thomas to know how many hours or minutes had gone by. Then he noticed a gentle light coming from the cabin windows through the trees. Instead of the yellowish brightness of a lantern or candle, it was a softer, nearly bluish hue that, as though breathing, it pulsed softly. Shadows flickered on the exterior walls as the light moved throughout the building. Despite his self-preservation instincts telling him to stay put, Thomas picked up his lantern and started to make his way carefully toward the cabin. Every step appeared to take a great deal of willpower. As he got closer, the surrounding air became denser, like he was traversing invisible water. As the singing intensified, he started to notice recurring themes in the tune: proposed goal and framework. With his flashlight shaking in his grasp, Thomas Whitmore came to a stop a few meters from the cabin entrance. The inner bluish light pulsed in a constant rhythm, casting patterns of shadows on the aged walls that seemed to have a life of their own. As soon as he got close, the song stopped abruptly, and there was a deep hush that Thomas could hear his own heart thumping hard against his ribs. He inhaled deeply, collecting all of his investigator's bravery, and went over the threshold. The cabin's interior was both entirely different and exactly as he had left it during his daytime visit. As though they were painted with phosphorescent paint, the symbols on the walls appeared to glow with their own luminosity. The circle of stones in the middle of the room was still there, and the bluish light concentrated more intensely in the space between them, creating a vertical pattern, even though Thomas knew that by day they were only opaque markings of plant ash. Column that extended from the ground to the ceiling. That illumination had no physical source, no bulb, no candle, just an enigmatic, glowing presence. Thomas compelled himself to remain calm as a scientist. He set his flashlight down on the floor and pulled out his notebook, starting to record everything with the accuracy his sharpened intellect could still muster, in spite of the terror pulsing through his veins. He sketched, characterized the ethereal nature of the light, and observed the room's freezing temperature. The markings on the walls appeared to pulse rapidly. As his senses registered every element of that bizarre experience, his hand scribbled on its own. He became aware that he wasn't alone at that moment. Something was present in the room, although it lacked a distinct physical form. Although Thomas was unable to view it directly, he could make out its form in the corner of his eye, a feminine silhouette that gracefully and fluidly circled the circle of stones. When he attempted to look directly, he could see only dancing shadows in that direction. However, the presence became indisputable when he allowed his vision to relax, making his perception less focused and more expansive. Then a voice came out of his own head, not from the air around him. It was Eliza Caldwell's voice. Despite the fact that he had never met her, he was positive. It had echoes of that weird melody he had heard minutes earlier, and it was gentle and melodic. She spoke in short bursts rather than whole phrases. Images started to come to him, memories that belonged to someone else, visions that weren't his own, and thoughts that developed right in his consciousness. In the last days before Eliza vanished, Thomas saw her. He watched as she painstakingly set up that area, drawing the symbols with complete focus, each stroke full of purpose and significance. For hours he observed her meditating in the middle of the stone circle, her breathing growing progressively slower and her consciousness gradually changing. He observed the ritual's final sitting in that circle on the new moon night, when she spoke in a language that existed before any historical record. Then Thomas realized that Eliza had not left in the traditional sense. She had experienced a purposeful metamorphosis, dissolving the limits of her physical existence in a way that was difficult for her logical mind to describe. She had transformed into a new entity that existed on the boundaries between the tangible and the intangible, with the ability to observing and impacting the physical environment without being totally constrained by it. Ancient societies knew this way of life, which contemporary civilization has either forgotten or discarded because it defied all accepted classifications. The images persisted, revealing Thomas. In the months that followed, he observed Eliza with a mix of sympathy and sadness as she watched her cabin being looted and her possessions being burned. He observed her making an effort to speak with the people she had treated, and her presence, appearing in ways that they perceived as disease or a curse, but which were actually awkward attempts to communicate through a veil dividing states of existence. There was no instruction manual for her new condition, no clear precedents for how to keep relationships with the society she had left behind, and she didn't want to incite fear or misery. She was crying, and Thomas could see it. That realization carried a deep melancholy, a loneliness that came with Eliza's decision. She had succeeded. Something remarkable surpassed the constraints that confined common humanity. However, she had separated herself entirely in the process. She was no longer able to communicate, touch, or be understood as she had in the past. Her metamorphosis was both liberation and banishment, triumph and tragedy. The presence in the room appeared to recognize her comprehension. For a brief moment, the bluish light became more intense, and Thomas experienced a wave of what he could only call thankfulness. Eliza knew that at last someone had realized that her decision would be viewed as an act of remarkable bravery driven by an unquenchable curiosity about the nature of existence, rather than just as crazy or wickedness. She wanted her experience to be shared as evidence of possibilities that existed outside of the conventional bounds of reality, rather than as a cautionary tale. Thomas attempted to ask questions in his head, looking for more precise information, but the pictures started to dim. The bluish light grew progressively weaker, the icons on. The cabin's thick air started to fade as the walls reverted to their typical opacity. Thomas saw that the presence was withdrawing not because it was withdrawn, but because it needed energy to continue that mode of communication, which it had not yet mastered. Eliza seemed to be adjusting to her new life, discovering the potential and constraints of her transformation. The eastern sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn when Thomas eventually came out of the cabin. Even though it seemed like only minutes, he had been inside for hours. His mind was overflowing with all he had gone through, but his legs shook from tiredness. When he got back to his tent, the flame had died down to lukewarm embers, and he spent the next few hours writing down everything he could recall, every detail, every feeling, every glimpse he had been given. Josiah McKinney waited tensely for him when he eventually made it back to the inn in the morning, obviously relieved to see him. Secure and sound. Thomas used language that avoided sounding like madness or fantasy as he described his encounter. He showed him his thorough notes, his drawings of the symbols, and his painstaking studies of the temperature and atmospheric variations. Josiah's face registered a complex blend of emotions as he listened silently, moving from skepticism to gradual recognition. Then the pastor revealed something he had previously kept to himself. During times of silent prayer, he had also sensed a non-malevolent presence. Had been afraid at first. Instead of seeing it as a threat, he saw it with wonder. Maybe, he said reluctantly, what the people had perceived as a curse was just the unease of being around something they couldn't define or comprehend. Fear of the unexplainable causes people to turn strangers into threats out of a basic need to protect themselves. Thomas stayed in the area for 3 more weeks, conducting interviews, seeing sights, and attempting to assemble a comprehensive account of the circumstances surrounding the Eliza Caldwell case. His notes, testimony, comments, and speculations filled 3 whole notebooks, demonstrating his scrupulous documentation of everything. However, he was aware that the scientific and academic communities would have differing opinions about his findings. The majority of his colleagues would probably reject his discoveries as fraud or fiction because they contradicted basic assumptions about the nature of reality. Thomas Whitmore was aware that he had to decide how best to deliver his discoveries to the globe. He pondered the ramifications of all he had seen while perusing his notes by candlelight during restless nights in his boarding house room. His scientific background required observable proof, reproducibility, and observations that could be independently confirmed. However, how could he conduct any type of traditional verification on the experience of that night in the cabin? How could he demonstrate the existence of something that was outside the realm of ordinary perception? Something that was contrary to the very tools that science employed to gauge reality. He made the decision to proceed cautiously. Thomas started investigating comparable historical cases in other mountainous areas of the United States, rather than publishing his most remarkable discoveries right once. Searching through old newspaper archives, county records, and correspondence kept by local historical groups, he visited libraries in Knoxville and Nashville. What he found was both unsettling and intriguing. Eliza Caldwell's situation was hardly unique. Similar disappearances over decades were documented in documents strewn across the Appalachian Mountains from Georgia to Pennsylvania. In isolated areas, lonely women who are frequently connected to traditional healing methods would just disappear without leaving any physical evidence. Following their withdrawal, numerous towns reported unexplained events, including weird lights, whispering whispers, and feelings of an invisible presence. The strikingly similar patterns indicated not random occurrences, but signs of something more profound and organized. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Scottish and Irish immigrant families arrived in the Appalachian region, and Thomas found particularly interesting connections in records that had been preserved. Oral tales from these cultures described knowledgeable women who sometimes made the mysterious decision to walk between realms. This phrase recurred in many sources. These customs explained a voluntary metamorphosis process that enabled some people to rise above the confines of physical life and become keepers of ancestors' wisdom and watchers of natural cycles. Additionally, the researcher discovered early 19th century letters between European scholars addressing comparable traditions recorded in remote areas of Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. Before those terms were commonly used, these researchers, many of whom were anthropologists and focus groups, had documented first-hand stories from local populations, where these changes were regarded as both feasible and a recognized component of a larger cosmology. Religious and governmental authorities would have viewed this knowledge as heresy or harmful superstition. Thus, it was carefully kept hidden. One particularly insightful finding was an unpublished paper written in 1823 by a doctor called Jonathan Pembroke that was discovered in the University of Virginia's archives. The report detailed his interaction with a remote village in the He had been summoned to cure an epidemic in the mountains of western Virginia. Pembroke saw what he described as a community elder perform a passage ritual when he was there. His account of the ritual's preparations, symbols, and atmosphere was remarkably similar to what Thomas had discovered in Eliza Caldwell's case. Pembroke's writing was a combination of philosophical discomfort and clinical interest. He explained how the elderly woman had changed after days of preparation. Awareness throughout the ceremony. Her body stayed still for hours, according to witnesses, and her respiration became inaudible, and her body temperature dropped sharply. She declared that she had crossed a threshold and glimpsed past the veil separating many planes of existence when she eventually woke up at daybreak. After a few weeks, she had vanished entirely, leaving behind only her deserted home and reports that her presence was still sensed in the nearby woods. Thomas became aware that he was up against something far more significant than a single case. There was a secret custom that spanned continents and generations. On the periphery of mainstream society, knowledge is kept and practiced. Eliza Caldwell was only one of many people who took this route, possibly the last in a long pedigree dating back to the beginning of time. Thomas was plagued by the question of whether these women actually attained transcendence or if their assumptions caused them to. Severe mental states that have disastrous outcomes. The first interpretation was substantially supported by his experience that night in the cottage. However, the scientist in him refused to embrace findings that would completely undermine his conception of reality. He made the decision to go back and make more observations in the Watauga area, looking for more proof to support or contradict his original theory. In the course of this second visit, which lasted all summer 1880, Thomas established stronger ties with community people. People who had been reluctant to talk at first started to trust him, and as a result, he started to learn more about Eliza's long-term effects on the area. Despite the enigmatic circumstances surrounding her leaving, many of the people she had looked after throughout her years there continued to express sincere thanks for her assistance. Among them was Samuel Pritchard, a farmer who had experienced a catastrophic accident in 1878 that caused serious injuries to his left leg. The only practical remedy, according to local physicians, was amputation. Samuel, however, refused and turned to Eliza as a last resort. She shocked even the doubtful doctors by using herbal mixtures to treat him for weeks, reducing inflammation and promoting healing. After regaining full use of his leg, Samuel saw Eliza as his rescuer. In July 1880, when Thomas chatted with Samuel, the farmer revealed something he had kept to himself. Within, he had started having vivid dreams in the weeks after Eliza vanished, in which she appeared to him as a glowing presence that conveyed sentiments of continuity and serenity rather than in physical form. Samuel gained information about medicinal plants from these dreams that he was unaware of at the time, but found to be shockingly accurate when he woke up. Eliza seemed to be continuing her healing work through him, utilizing him as a bridge between the physical world and her new form of existence. The world. Thomas painstakingly recorded this story, identifying trends that linked Samuel's experience to other testimonials he had gathered. Numerous individuals who had known Eliza described having similar dreams in which they gained understanding and sensed her presence when they needed it. Although these experiences were not always the same or consistent, they had certain characteristics in common that pointed to a shared origin. It seemed as though Eliza kept connections with people who had put their trust in her new life, continued to provide safety and direction in ways that went beyond traditional communication. Additionally, the researcher found that the unsettling incidents that had afflicted the neighborhood right after Eliza vanished had progressively subsided. The unexplained illnesses stopped. The frequency of sightings at night decreased, and the overall terror started to fade. It seemed as though there had been a period of transition and adjustment during which Eliza, in her new shape, and the community had to adjust to living in a different reality. Josiah McKinney told Thomas that he had undergone a significant shift in viewpoint. The pastor said that at first he had seen only demonic threat or evil influence, viewing everything through a strict religious lens. However, he had begun to doubt these assurances after months of introspection and prayer. He reluctantly proposed that perhaps God was much more vast and enigmatic than his ideas could explain. Maybe there were elements of creation that was kept out of the mainstream of human knowledge and only accessible to those few who were foolish or courageous enough to investigate it. On the porch of the tiny church, Thomas and Josiah would spend long afternoons talking as they struggled to make sense of experiences that fundamentally contradicted their belief systems. During these candid and in-depth discussions, two men with such different perspectives were able to agree on the size of the unknown. Thomas was no longer perceived by Josiah as a danger to religion, but as an investigator of riddles that supported rather than conflicted with his own spiritual endeavors. Thomas Whitmore started to notice small changes in himself as the summer of 1880 went on through the Watauga Mountains. His nights were filled with incredibly vivid dreams in which he traveled through seemingly familiar yet unattainable settings. Mountains that extended beyond any realistic horizon, rivers whose waters were bathed in glittering light that came from no discernible source, and forests flowed against the force of gravity. In these dreams, he sometimes caught a glimpse of the feminine presence he had seen in the cabin, always watching, never coming close, but unmistakably affecting his consciousness. When Thomas awoke, he found that his sense of the world had sharpened in ways that could not be explained. He saw linkages between seemingly unconnected phenomena, synchronicity that indicated an explanation, and patterns in nature that had previously gone undiscovered. Beneath the seeming turmoil of daily life is an underlying order. His experience that night in the cabin seemed to have expanded his ability to perceive beyond the traditional bounds of the physical senses, opening doors in his consciousness that could no longer be fully closed. During one of their weekly chats, he told Martha Henderson about these insights. With a knowing look on her face and a faint smile at the corners of her mouth, the elderly woman listened. Then she disclosed something. She had been cautious, holding off on sharing until the appropriate time. Martha admitted that she had undergone comparable changes during her protracted therapy with Eliza years before Thomas had ever come to the area. These were progressive awakenings of dormant sensitivity rather than abrupt or spectacular alterations. Martha talked about how she started to see energy fields surrounding plants and animals, how she came to have health and illness intuitions that were beyond any traditional medical knowledge, how she had started to dream of things that would happen in the future and then come to pass. She had concealed these encounters out of concern that the conservative community would label her as insane or worse. However, she had seen in Thomas an understanding person whose thinking was open enough to take into account options that the majority of people would quickly dismiss. The community gained a great deal of trust after Martha's disclosure. Over the next few days and weeks, others started to covertly look for Thomas and tell him about their own amazing adventures. A hunter named Elijah Stone described how, by merely watching minute changes in the atmosphere that he was unable to express verbally but could sense viscerally, he had acquired an unexplainable capacity to anticipate weather patterns with an accuracy that outperformed any conventional approach. Rebecca Walsh, a midwife, explained how she started to sense the health of unborn children by placing her hands on their tummies. Women who are pregnant. Data that regularly demonstrated accuracy. Thomas came to understand that he was recording a much larger phenomenon of collective transformation rather than just a single instance of enigmatic vanishing. Even in her transformed form, Eliza seemed to still have a significant impact on the area. Thomas came to the conclusion that she wasn't bringing about these changes through direct action or supernatural intervention, but rather through a resonance that awakened hidden potentials in others who had been in close proximity to her. She resembled a tuning fork that, by vibrating at a particular frequency, triggered similar harmonies in adjacent instruments. In an effort to explain these findings without turning solely to mystical or supernatural interpretations, the researcher started formulating a theory. He proposed that most people lived with large amounts of their perceptual capacity permanently, but that human consciousness may have been far more expansive and capable than is widely acknowledged. Dormant. These capacities may be awakened by certain techniques, like the ones Eliza had researched and put into practice, which would extend the boundaries of awareness and interaction with reality. It's possible that what people saw as paranormal or supernatural occurrences were actually typical facets of the human experience that were either forgotten or repressed by modern society. For its time, it was a groundbreaking idea that foresaw advancements in disciplines like psychology, neuroscience, and study that wouldn't come about for decades. On altered awareness, Thomas was aware that making it public would draw mockery and even ruin his standing as a legitimate scholar, even while future generations would have to acknowledge the significance of what he was seeing. He also felt a strong obligation to record and preserve it. Thomas made the decision to carry out a meticulously regulated experiment in August 1880. With Josiah McKinney's assistance and a few community volunteers who had demonstrated receptivity to novel experiences, in the area where Eliza's hut was located, he set up a night watch. In order to provide a common record that would be more reliable than individual testimony, the objective was to jointly notice any events that might occur. According to Thomas's calculations based on Eliza's diary entries, the selected night was August 23rd during a waxing moon phase, which coincided with one of the times she deemed auspicious for ritual practice. Other than Thomas Josiah, there were 7 persons in the group: Elijah Stone, Martha Samuel Pritchard, Rebecca Walsh, and 2 more locals who had important interactions with Eliza. Each carried a notepad to document their own observations, resulting in a variety of viewpoints on any events that took place. They stood in a circle around the deserted cabin, keeping a respectable distance but still being able to see each other. Thomas had given them all instructions to observe in meditative silence without any set expectations, just willing to see whatever comes up. With only the typical noises of the night forest permeating the atmosphere, the first several hours went by in tranquility. However, the same atmospheric shifts that Thomas had noticed during his solo vigil started to happen at midnight. Everyone present independently noted the sudden dip in temperature in their notebooks. A feeling of pressure against the skin resulted from the dense, charged air. Then, one by one, each group member started to sense the existence. In the traditional sense, it was invisible. Although it didn't make a sound, everyone in the room could tell it was real. It appeared as though something or someone had entered the circle, taking up space between the human viewers, sensing their attention, and reacting to it in a subtle but noticeable way. The first person to respond vocally was Martha, who whispered gently that she sensed Eliza's presence and that, despite months of bodily absence, others concurred, each offering a unique perspective that, when put together, produced a composite image of the common experience. According to Rebecca, Samuel reported experiencing a deep sense of calm flowing from the presence, and sensing that a great deal of knowledge was being held that was just out of grasp for ordinary cognition. Elijah saw that the air circulation patterns surrounding the clearing had altered in ways that went against accepted meteorological theory. Thomas painstakingly recorded everything, noting with his scientific mind both the features of the experience that are both objective and subjective. He observed that in contrast to his single vigil, where the presence had appeared with nearly overwhelming intensity, this time it appeared softer and more restrained, as though it had learnt to more precisely manage its influence. This provided more proof that Eliza, or whomever she had become, was changing in her new life and becoming more adept at interacting with the physical world in ways that weren't uncomfortable or fear. The midwife, Rebecca Walsh's sudden transition into a trance-like condition marked the culmination of the event. Her eyes were still open, but her attention shifted to someplace outside of her typical field of vision. Her voice was different from her typical timbre when she talked. It was deeper and more resonant. She would subsequently clarify that the words she spoke were information that was entering her from an outside source rather than her own conscious thoughts. Rebecca discussed transformational cycles that ruled all existence, that each person's consciousness was a part of a much wider network of collective consciousness, and that the lines separating life and death, material and ethereal, were far more permeable than most people realized. She saw Eliza's journey as an expansion of existence rather than its cessation, a deeper immersion in life rather than an escape from it. And she delivered a message that appeared to be straight from Eliza. Thank you to everyone who tried to comprehend. Instead of condemning hope, consider the possibility that future generations will profit from the ancient wisdom preserved through her sacrifice. Rebecca felt as like she had acted as a conduit for something significant when she came out of the trance, fatigued but composed and unable to recall what she had said. Given that she had experienced an extraordinary event that had left her momentarily vulnerable, the other group members showed her support and care. Thomas took notes on everything she said, realizing that this knowledge, no matter where it came from, offered deep insights into the nature of the issue he was looking into. As the first rays of dawn appeared in the eastern sky, the vigil came to an end. Each member of the group took the profundity of the shared experience with them as they gradually parted. They got together several times over the next several days to compare their notes, talk about their impressions, and try to make sense of what they had seen as a group. What came out of these conversations was amazing. Agreement. Everyone concurred that they had seen something or someone real, that the encounter went beyond group delusions or suggestions, and that Eliza Caldwell was still alive in a different but authentic form. Over the next week, Thomas synthesized all the data he had gathered over his months in the area. He produced a lengthy essay that blended scientific rigor with receptivity to ideas that went against conventional wisdom. It contained numerous testimony and documents, combining independent observations, historical pattern analysis, and his own theories in an effort to explain the phenomenon within a framework that could eventually be verified or improved by subsequent generations of researchers. In September 1880, Thomas Whitmore departed the Watauga region with a newfound awareness of the boundaries of human existence, in addition to notebooks full of observations. With the intention of compiling his research into a format that might be published, he went back to his hometown of Pennsylvania, but he soon found that the academic community at the time was not ready to take his findings seriously. Scientific journal editors rejected his work without giving it any thought. Institutions that had previously funded his study started to turn away from him when other researchers voiced concerns about his mental health. Thomas chose to take a different approach, frustrated but not defeated. He started disseminating his research in alternative periodicals that examined the limits of philosophy, science, and spirituality. Although these magazines were smaller and had a smaller readership, they drew readers who were open-minded and curious about occurrences that were disregarded by conventional science. His investigation into Eliza Caldwell and the Watauga incidents found a willing, if small, audience through these means. Most importantly, Thomas started getting letters from people all around the nation who knew of similar incidents or had experienced similar things. Letters came from Texas, Oregon, Missouri, and Vermont. Each outlined circumstances in which people, typically women who were familiar with customs, have mysteriously vanished, leaving behind unexplained events. The striking consistency of the pattern suggested that what he had seen in Watauga was a part of a much larger phenomenon that was taking place across the United States on the periphery of traditional culture. A Boston professor named Eliza Wright, who had been studying occult customs introduced to the American people, was one particularly fascinating correspondent. Continent by immigrants from Europe. Eliza had gathered historical papers from the colonial era that detailed instances of women who were accused of questionable activities but who, rather than being put to death as witches, simply vanished before the authorities could apprehend them. According to her theory, some of these women had true knowledge that enabled them to flee persecution in ways other than traditional physical flight. Thomas began communicating with Eliza on a daily basis, and, together, they started mapping a secret web of customs and behaviors that had endured for many generations, in spite of ongoing repression by the state and church establishment. They found spots in the mountains and forests that functioned as hubs for these covert teachings, oral traditions that had been meticulously kept and passed down only to trusted initiates, and lineages of knowledge that could be traced through certain families. In Watauga, on the other hand, things were slowly getting back to normal. During a winter storm in 1881, Eliza Caldwell's cottage eventually fell, its rotten planks breaking way under the weight of the snow that had collected. The forest gradually reclaimed the land because the community did not try to preserve or reconstruct it. Even though they seldom ever talked about it publicly, individuals who had first-hand knowledge of Eliza's existence kept their connections to her ongoing presence. Martha Henderson used the knowledge she discreetly credited to Eliza's instruction and the enlarged intuitions she had subsequently acquired. Combinations of medicines, and something more subtle, the capacity to sense energetic imbalances that influenced her treatment decisions in ways she couldn't logically explain, were used to treat patients, and the outcomes were consistently favorable. People traveled from far-off areas to seek her assistance, and Martha always treated them with kindness and caution. Samuel Pritchard continued to run his prosperous farm, but he also started setting aside time to growing a medical garden in which he kept plants that Eliza had utilized in her treatments. Unlike Martha, he did not think of himself as a healer, although he did occasionally give herbs to neighbors in need, always with thorough instructions on how to prepare and utilize them. He kept a journal in which he documented his dreams, many of which still included visits from the glowing entity he connected to Eliza. He also continued to learn about the characteristics of plants through these dreams, which he later confirmed to be true. Rebecca Walsh, the midwife who had channeled messages during the vigil, found that her powers had been permanently enhanced by that night's encounter. She gained an almost mystical reputation for being able to predict when women would give birth, frequently reaching their residences before the expectant mothers were even aware that the process had started. In ways that skilled medical professionals couldn't understand, her hands appeared to have healing abilities, reducing pain and accelerating recuperation. She gave credit to Olive, thanks to the blessing she had experienced as a result of her interaction with Eliza's transformed self. Possibly the most significant change of all was experienced by Josiah McKinney. The pastor started to challenge the strict beliefs he had maintained all of his life, allowing himself to be open to a broader conception of the divine that included mysteries rather than trying to eradicate them. His preaching shifted from judgment to amazement at the size of the universe. This made several conservative families uncomfortable in his group. New path, but others discovered the spiritual freedom they had always yearned for. Josiah started researching mystical traditions from other cultures in an effort to find similarities that might indicate to universal truths about the essence of life. Over time, Eliza Caldwell's case progressively became a local folktale. A legacy of unexplained phenomena was left behind as new generations were born and nurtured, hearing hushed tales of the enigmatic woman who had vanished in the mountains. Some people wrote it all off as superstition. Others revered the mysteries that their own grandfathers and grandmothers vowed to be real, but cautiously. For individuals looking to connect with something more than themselves, the forest where her cabin had once stood became a destination of silent pilgrimage because they had an innate sense that it had a unique resonance. Up until his passing in 1904, Thomas Whitmore carried out more research. Although his discoveries were never widely acknowledged, he had an impact on a small but committed group of scholars who kept investigating the boundaries between awareness, science, and remarkable experience. Elelena Wright saved his notebooks and placed them in a special archive at the library of a forward-thinking university in Massachusetts, where they would always be available to future researchers who could see their worth. A young anthropologist named Sarah Chen visited Watauga in 1920, 40 years after Eliza vanished, as part of an effort to record Appalachian folklore customs. She'd read Thomas Whitmore's writings and was resolved to find out if any recollections or proof of the case remained. Sarah was shocked by what she found. No one had forgotten the story. Elders in the area continued to discuss Eliza with awe and mystery, and some said that she was still present on some evenings when the fog hung heavy over the mountains. Sarah conducted interviews with Thomas's acquaintances' descendants. She talked to the granddaughter of Martha Henderson, who had inherited detailed accounts of Eliza Caldwell and the remarkable occurrences of 1879 and 1880, in addition to her grandmother's healing talent. She went to the location where the cabin had been, which was now mostly covered by the forest, but where a strange clearing remained where trees, seemingly honoring invisible space, refused to grow densely. Sarah Chen stayed in that hilly area for weeks, listening to tales that had been handed down through the generations like priceless echoes that were protected from forgetting. She became aware of that the Eliza Caldwell case had grown beyond the first incidents and had become ingrained in the community's culture. It was a tale that people told around campfires to help them make sense of the borders between the known and the unknown, and to explain unexplainable occurrences. Sarah was particularly intrigued by the narrative's emotional coherence. There was a core of experienced truth that withstood distortion, even after several retellings and decades. People didn't talk about Eliza with deep respect and a hint of sadness, but not with terror or dread. She stood for possibilities that were being swiftly erased by contemporary society. Knowledge that would disappear as the globe grew increasingly homogeneous and industrialized. Sarah accepted an invitation to stroll to the unique clearing where the cabin had once stood on one of her final nights in the area. An old woman who had intimately known Eliza's grandparents served as her guide. When they reached the location at sunset, the golden light of the shadow and light patterns appeared to dance on the leaf-covered ground as the fading sun streamed through the treetops. The dramatic occurrence that Thomas Whitmore had written about in his notebooks did not happen to Sarah. However, she detected a faint element, a quality in the atmosphere that hinted at an ancient perceptive presence. It was an emotion that was hard to describe, more intuition than precise sensory sense, yet it was vivid enough for her to comprehend the significance of that location for the local population. Something about that clearing prompted reflection and caused ideas to veer into deep inquiries concerning the essence of life and the boundaries of human awareness. Sarah thought about all the stories she had gathered and the bigger picture they created when combined as she stood there. She came to the conclusion that Eliza Caldwell's actual legacy was not found in the particulars of her disappearance or the mysterious events that surrounded it. The way her tale came to light was the legacy, potentialities, how it upended cozy assumptions and served as a reminder that the world was much bigger and more enigmatic than any theoretical framework could adequately account for. Sarah's perspective on the value of preserving stories that resided on the periphery of what was acceptable had changed by the time she returned to her academic career. She wrote a great deal about her research, always being cautious to frame it as an investigation of oral traditions and cultural beliefs rather than as confirmation of paranormal activity. However, she acknowledged in her private writings that she had encountered something in that clearing that was beyond the realm of reason, and that it had caused her to wonder whether there were more profound realities concealed in those mountain tales. As time went on, the world changed in ways that those who experienced the initial events could never have predicted. The mountains are traversed by paved highways. Places that had previously only experienced nighttime darkness were given artificial light thanks to electricity. And the way humans lived and saw their surroundings was entirely changed by contemporary technologies. However, the tale of Eliza Caldwell endured in the peaceful creases of those old mountains in localities that continued to have ties to earlier customs. The idea that maybe not everything could be measured, explained, or controlled by science and technology persisted as a tale that grandparents told and that young people listened to with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. It was a memory of a time when people lived in greater proximity to secrets, when the line separating the ordinary from the extraordinary was more pliable, and when exceptional people had the freedom to follow paths that went against all norms. This concludes our exploration of one of the most fascinating secrets that the mountains have to offer. There are still many mysteries surrounding Eliza Caldwell's story. Testimonies, tales, and possibilities that will never be fully revealed are weaved together to create a tapestry. It extends an invitation to challenge our assumptions about the nature of awareness and transformation, the limits of human experience, and the distinctions between various kinds of life. Most significantly, tales like these serve as a reminder to maintain our humility in the face of the unknown. They show us that there is a lot more to the world than we can perceive with our senses, see with our eyes, or understand with reason. They leave room for awe, mystery, and the notion that reality is far away, richer and more intricate than what our minds can process. Consider subscribing to the channel if this tale moved you and piqued your interest in the secrets that lurk in the obscure corners of history. There are a ton of unsolved mysteries and stories that are just waiting tremendous be told. Comment with your ideas, your personal encounters with the unexplainable, or just a location from where you are observing us. And keep in mind that the words that were whispered through. There is always more to those old mountains than meets the eye. And the most intriguing secrets are those that encourage us to broaden our comprehension of what is feasible until the subsequent voyage into the shadows of.